regional issues that could be of concern and difficult?
Well, yes, I'm a complete realist about these things. So global cooperation through the UN, through the Security Council, even on Iran, even on other complex questions including climate change, tick, pretty good. The closer we get to home, the harder it gets. And that's where you have forward US military deployments, which go back to the end of the Second World War, here in East Asia and the West Pacific. And China's view, strategic view, that these alliances and these deployments are no longer necessary in a post-Cold War environment. So we have complex, what I describe as diplomatic management challenges. How do we arrive at a common position to avoid conflict by accident? Will test everyone's skills.
You have a China, as you described earlier, becoming much more active and even proactive in international politics.
That's true.
Of course, also in regional politics as well. What would that mean for the rest of the region and the rest of the world?
When we look at China's increasingly activist, and I've used the term proactive, foreign policy posture across the world, it's kind of natural. It's a big country. You're the second largest economy in the world. You've got a lot going on in the world. And so it follows that you will not simply be Tao Guang Yang Hui, hide your strength, bide your time, forever. That's kind of natural. And when you saw, I think, the reported comments of Xi Jinping at the Foreign Policy Work Conference in November of 2014, he was articulating a reality which already existed. China has global economic interests, China has global political interests, and China's therefore going to be globally active. Even on simple questions, but hard questions at the same time, like you've got a major security crisis in North Africa, suddenly you've got 10, 15, 20,000 Chinese nationals you've got to evacuate.
That's right.
What do you do? So China can't simply stay behind locked doors and saying, "我不知道." So there's a natural element to this. And it's good to see China more active in the United Nations system, more active in the UN Security Council.
What about neighborhood safety?
Yeah, I'll come on to that. Now, regionally, in the Asia-Pacific region, yes, you have many conflicting perspectives. The American perspective, very bluntly, is this. They defeated Japan in the war. They decided strategically to remain in the region since then in order to preserve regional peace and stability, because prior to that there was none. And their argument is that that peace and stability has underpinned the unprecedented economic growth of East Asia over the last 30 years. And they'll say that occurred because no one ever thought of actually turning any of their territorial disputes into a large-scale war. People forgot about military questions, they got on with making money. And it's been pretty good. Now, the Chinese perspective is quite different. Chinese perspective is, okay, we sort of understand some of that. And thank you, you did participate in the anti-Japanese war, even though Japan invaded China in the 1930s and you guys in America only woke up about it in 1941. We understand that. But in the period since 49 or 45, or at least since the Korean War in 53, why are you still here? Why do you believe you have a unique strategic role to provide what you describe as peace and stability?
Well, Chinese government has said it very clearly. The United States is a big Asia-Pacific power, and China would like to work with that within the system in order to improve the neighborhood relations. The only thing China doesn't like, it seems, from the Chinese side, is the United States playing a role of taking side.
The American response to that, and I talk to them a lot about this, would be, okay, on the territorial disputes in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, well, let's take the South China Sea in itself. They take no position. What they say they're not neutral on is what they describe as freedom of navigation. And this is where it gets really complicated.
There are different interpretations of what freedom of navigation is.
And there are massively different interpretations.
That's right, and there are different clauses of international law that each side can subscribe to. All of these.
So, and unfortunately, I'm very familiar with most of this. And so therefore...
I'm sure you do, sir.
And so therefore, the practical challenge is, recognising the Chinese position, understanding there are different positions by many of the neighbouring states, and understanding the historical position of the US in terms of what they describe as freedom of navigation, how do we have a system of regional diplomacy which manages all these disagreements? Let's bear in mind that for most of the period since 1949, the South China Sea hasn't been an issue. So it may be idealistic of me, but how do we get back to a position whereby it's no longer an issue so that we can all get on with the business of, shall I say, common economic development? Remember, with the East China Sea, until that crazy decision by an earlier Japanese government to go and buy the island for their own reasons. I mean, they thought in some respects they were doing the right thing because the governor of Tokyo, I think it was at the time, was about to privatise it and turn it into an anti-Chinese crusade. But leave that to one side. As a result of those changes, China reacted. But after a period of time, things in the East China Sea have stabilised, and relations between Beijing and Tokyo at present are reasonable.
I'm not sure whether the relations between China and Japan on the historical issues and on the territorial issues can be described as reasonable, as you just said. And meanwhile, what kind of mechanism are you trying to prescribe or suggest here in order to bring back, as you describe, as peace and stability as it used to be, because things have already changed?
I don't think I described positions as being reasonable one way or the other. What I said was the state of Chinese-Japanese relations was now reasonable compared with the past. And if you go to Tokyo today and Beijing today and talk about the Sino-Japanese relationship compared with 3 years ago, there's been a big change in the right direction. Hasn't solved the problems underneath it all in terms of the conflicting territorial positions. But what I'm looking for is how do we obtain that level of, shall I say, reasonable stability.
But tension could come back at any moment as a result of unresolved disputes.
That's true, but that's the case with unresolved territorial disputes along the 38th parallel between North and South Korea, between South Korea and Japan over unresolved territorial questions, between South Korea and China. Certainly between China and Japan and the East China Sea. Then you have the great question of national reunification concerning Taiwan. You head to the South China Sea, you've got all those problems. You've got unresolved questions between Cambodia and Thailand. That's before we get to the Sino-Indian border and the Sino-Pakistan border. So there's lots of these problems in our region. The question is, are we going to use diplomacy to manage them, or is our diplomacy not going to be sufficient to prevent conflict by act?
The question is, if I understand, Mr. Prime Minister, is whether China and the United States can work together in one region, for example, the Asia-Pacific region, while recognizing each other's status, both in the region and probably in the future.
Exactly.
Since 1949, China-US relations have evolved from tense standoffs to a complex mix of intensifying diplomacy, growing international rivalry, and increasingly intertwined economies. In 1972, U.S. President Richard Nixon visited China at the invitation of Premier Zhou Enlai, starting the process of normalizing China-US relations. The two countries officially established diplomatic relations at the ambassadorial level in 1979. In recent years, China has played an increasing role in major regional and international issues, which has deepened China-US cooperation, but has also resulted in some inevitable twists and turns. As the two countries work to establish a new type of power relationship, the key to success surely lies in expanding common interests, controlling differences, and applying diplomatic wisdom.
You argued, Mr. Prime Minister, that China and the United States, in order to establish better confidence about one another and strategic trust, has to have one central strategy.
Well, I think we should not overestimate complexity. Sometimes we say it's all too complex, therefore there is no solution. I don't see it that way. In Chinese you have an expression which is 治大国
蓬
小仙.
Meaning,
essentially,
help our international viewers with that.
Well, no, it's an expression which in my view is about how you frankly, simplify strategic concepts into something which is doable. If you look at the transcripts of Nixon and Kissinger's discussions with Mao and Zhou Enlai in 1972, they were dealing with questions of high politics at the height of the Cold War, the height of the Vietnam War, and yet between them they were able to carve out, frankly, a new architecture for how the US and China would engage each other for the future, paving the way for what then happened with Deng Xiaoping later in that decade. So political leadership can deal with these things. And if you look at those records, they were dealing with questions of what do we have in common, what don't we have in common, and how do we cooperate on the things that we have in common. So when I look at China and US current challenges, it's a bit the same. What's my own recommended formulation? It's what I've described in English as constructive realism, and in Chinese it's 建设性的现实主义. But what I mean by that is, what's realist here? In a realist way, acknowledge the 4 or 5 areas where at present China and the US cannot agree. East China Sea, South China Sea, maybe cyber, maybe human rights. And be clear about that. Also have a management mechanism so that none of these blow up and destroy the entire relationship. Then over here, you've got a whole bunch of common interests in areas which are hard, but where you can cooperate and produce real results.
Such as what?
North Korea. It's a big one. It's a huge one. If the North Koreans acquire a nuclear-tipped missile capable of targeting Japan, Korea, or capable of targeting Guam or Hawaii or the West Coast, let me tell you, the strategic impact of that across our region will be disastrous in terms of the reactions that it will bring about. So that is a hard one, but it's doable in terms of high-level US and Chinese cooperation. Then you've got easier ones, which are sometimes in the security space, but sometimes in the non-security space, like climate change. So my overall argument is, like my argument concerning an Asia-Pacific community, which is if through constructive realism you can be constructive about these difficult problems, constructive about some of the easier areas of cooperation, and realist about where you can't agree for the foreseeable future. That is a strategic concept that you can work with for the future.
May I scrutinize just a little bit what you have just suggested?
Scrutinize,
for example,
scrutinize away.
Such as the DPRK issue, we did see China and the United States together with many other important players through the UN Security Council come up with resolution 22-7. And however, when you see the details of the policy explanation coming from different sides, it could be a little bit interesting. For example, Mr. Prime Minister, you know this better than I do, that China advocates about full implementation of the Security Council resolution, which includes sanctions and a lot of efforts to be made on negotiation and dialogue, and also make sure that the regime is not going to fall, eventually going to lead to all kinds of disasters in the region, unpredictable. However, you see the Western countries, particularly the United States, pretty much advocates on the sanction part and applauded China on that specific effort to work with the US on the sanctions. So you see all these details are very different as a result of a different foreign policy emphasis and also agendas. So even on these very common ground that you mentioned, there seem to be very different issues. Secondly, if I could, Mr. Prime Minister, the United States has been struggling with these priorities, what it cares, and what are the priority list for example, the Obama administration, not to even mention the incoming new administration, unpredictable. So all of these, would they ever work even on some of the most important issues that you see as common ground?
Well, in diplomacy, like in life, you can either focus exclusively on the negative, or you can choose to focus on the positive.
That's true.
And turn the negative into positive over time. That's my basic philosophy in life.
Help me to be more positive, Mr. Prime Minister.
So therefore, what you have in that UN Security Council resolution is a toughly negotiated 2-week-long process between the US, China and Russia, effectively, on a balanced and strong resolution. And you're right, there are different emphases within the resolution. But it's not unique in international relations for one side to come and say, hey, the resolution says that, and for the other side to say, the resolution says this.
That's true.
It's not the first time it's happened in the world. It's happened hundreds of times before. The key thing is that there is a resolution, and I believe there is an obligation to, on behalf of the international community, to enforce the sanctions regime, but also to take seriously the question of how do you dialogue effectively with Pyongyang. There are multiple internal proposals for how that could or should proceed. And I'm in the old-fashioned school, which simply says it's better to talk than not to talk. Because if you're not talking, the problem's likely to get worse. So, as an example...
I'm not sure whether it's an old-fashioned school. It's rather a responsible school you're talking about.
Well, yeah, I'm a professional optimist. And in fact, in global diplomacy, I think it is too easy for people to say, this is unfixable, this is unsolvable, it's too complex, it's too hard. We need a different psychology of international relations, which is, okay, how do we simplify this? What are the core moving parts in this complex diplomatic puzzle, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's Syria, whether it's Iraq, or whether it's elsewhere? And what can we do? Where are the intersecting sets of interest that we can work on?
Right.
In other words, it's a mindset. Otherwise, you have international diplomacy just going round and round in circles, and having one 座谈会 sit-down meeting after another,
without any results.
Without any results.
Yeah.